Hi, everybody. Today's Thursday, January 16th, and our friend Michael Hudson and Richard Wolff are back with us. After 2 weeks, we didn't have Richard Wolff, and he's back with us. Welcome back.
Thank you very much. I missed being on the show because it has become a regular part of my work.
So let's get started with what's going on in the Middle East, a ceasefire. After more than a year, here is what Hart reported in Israel that Trump forced Netanyahu to accept the deal. And when it comes to the importance of this new attitude on the part of the administration in the United States, we don't know yet who is mostly responsible for this peace talks. But many people, as Horace pointed out, are saying that Donald Trump is behind this. And many people may remember those days in 1981 with Carter and Reagan with the hostages in Iran, and Reagan came to power on January 20th. The hostages were released by the Iranian government in those days. What's the importance of these days that we are living, Richard, in terms of what's going on in Gaza?
Well, I mean, there are many ways to read this. I think Haaretz is right. I think that will be the judgment of history. You can't possibly imagine that the arrival of a new president is just coincidentally connected with this uh, decision to have a ceasefire. So it clearly is not something that Biden did because he couldn't do it for the whole history of the war is a history of miscalculation. They weren't ready to prevent it. They weren't ready to deal with it. They weren't ready to work out an accommodation. They blocked it from the earliest meetings in February of 2022 when the war had just begun and they were meeting. We all know about these meetings now because of what was said. We know about the whole buildup toward the war. Angela Merkel made it crystal clear, and others have corroborated it. So the bottom line is that Mr. Trump was prepared through his emissary, Mr. Witkoff. He was prepared to say what everybody knew Mr. Biden could have said at any point, or to make it more accurate, Mr. Biden said all kinds of things, but he didn't do anything. The bottom line is Israel could not have such a war without the money and the weapons provided by the United States. If at any time a serious threat to the Israelis, including Mr. Netanyahu, a serious threat to withdraw the money and or the weapons, and you would have gotten this decision. And therefore, and the history will make this judgment whether we do or not. The complicity of the United States in what Israel did in Gaza is hereby established. I mean, most of us understood it already, but here it's crystal clear. Whatever the words were, Israel understood that the new president would not hesitate to do what the old president repeatedly hesitated to do. And that made all the difference, as most of us understood. In the larger historical frame, let me go further. Israel as a society made the decision through many years and many different governments to hitch its wagon, to make its bed with the United States, to become dependent upon the United States in virtually every major way. Militarily, for sure, financially, for sure, and politically, right down to the most recent United Nations votes, which had weird numbers like 120 countries on one side, a dozen in the middle, and the United States and Israel virtually alone. I mean, you have achieved over time not just a close alliance, but you achieved utter isolation. And that's not going to go away because the kind of warfare undertaken in Gaza makes all of that worse, makes it last longer, makes it run deeper. And you're going to see, I'm sure, over the months and years ahead, since this ceasefire is just that, it's not a solution to the war. It is an agreement not to continue fighting for a while. You're going to see very active efforts on the part of all of the Middle East, all the Arab countries, allied with all the Islamic countries, allied with all their supporters inside the BRICS and outside as well. And that's going to keep up the isolation, keep up the difficulty. Israel has hooked its future as it has hooked its past on the United States. But here's the key problem. The United States, as Michael and I have been discussing with you, Nima, for months now, the United States empire is declining, shrinking, dying, if you like. And American capitalism has got an accumulation of problems. Not the least of those problems are so severe that the only reaction the country has is to deny it. So we just had a presidential election in which neither Mr. Trump nor Biden nor Kamala Harris said a word about a declining empire, said a word about an accumulation of economic problems that really are historic, long-lasting, long-building. Instead, they engaged in what passes for politics in this country is the theater of blaming each other as if one or the other party were the problem instead of one and the other party being the problem. So I think what we have reached is a historical shift. The United States, in trying to cope with the problems it denies it has, is prepared to throw Israel under the bus. It was something that could have and should have been understood from the beginning. There were other paths for Israel to follow. It could have related to its own Arab community. Let's all remember Israel, roughly speaking, is a country of 7 million Arabs and 7 million Jews. And there's a complicated way of trying to work such a society. It has been accomplished in other countries. It does not have to mean endless warfare. That's a silly idea. There are alternatives. They didn't pursue them, or at least the dominant forces in Israel. To Israel's credit, they have always had an opposition. They have one now. Haaretz is part of that opposition that you have just shown us, that clip. But the dominant politics of that country made them have an alliance which they have never really questioned and which is now confronting them with what it means to be the very junior partner to an alliance with an enormously powerful country that is losing the power that made you ally with them in the first place. This reality is going to have to be faced, no matter how long it's covered over with political noise of the sort we're going to be seeing a lot of in the weeks ahead.
Well, Richard has said pretty much anything that I could have said about that. I guess there are a couple of questions. Why has Israel depended so much on the United States? It's not only because the United States Zionists have given hundreds of millions of dollars of support to the Zionist charge, but it's also because Israel is allowed to bribe politicians, Congress, lawmakers in the United States in a way that it can't do in any other country because of Citizens United. Citizen United has privatized the political process here and said it's okay to have your policies decided by your donors. And all Israel has to do is ask for Congress for money, send part of the money back to the congressional campaigns, and it's a circular flow. And that has essentially bought Congress. But what you're saying, Richard, is, well, Trump is not Congress. Trump is an entirely different situation. He has got $100 million from Sheldon Adelson's wife to support Israel. What can Trump say? He can say, well, of course I support Israel, but I don't support Netanyahu. And he's had a lot of problems with Netanyahu, as have the Israeli citizens as a whole. And so that's one issue. It's all going to come down, as Richard points out, is after the inauguration at the beginning of next week, is Trump going to continue to authorize the shipping of bombs and military support to Israel? And in fact, will he have the power over the army to really stop this? Well, the problem is that next week is only the first day of his administration. What he said he's going to do is end the independence of the CIA, the National Security Agency, and the FBI to essentially disobey the orders that the executive branch gives to it. How long will it take him to actually enforce that? And is there any enforceability? And everything that we're talking about in Israel and the Ukraine comes down to enforceability. Agreements are easy to make. Netanyahu has already said, we'll sign any agreement you want, but we're not going to follow it. We're going to do whatever I want. And what I want is what the Israeli people want. We want to kill everyone in Israel who is not Jewish. We want to kill, this is a race war. It's a civilizational war. We consider the Gazians, as we've said, to be subhumans, and God told us to kill him. Our agreement, we have a covenant with God. That's our agreement. And no agreement that we make with Arab countries who we do not respect, or with the United States, is stronger than our covenant with God to murder all the non-Israelis here, so we can have a truly religious, God-fearing state. That's the mentality that we're dealing with. And in a way, you could say this has a parallel with what Trump has promised to do at the beginning of his administration with Ukraine. How can Ukraine feels exactly the same way? It doesn't matter what kind of agreement they've made. They've made agreements in the past with Russia. They have their constitutional statement of how Ukraine is supposed to be. We're back down to the enforcement issue, and we're in an era now where there's really no such thing as enforceable international law. And that means that almost all the agreements that we're talking about are meant to sound good without any intention of following through. The kind of agreements that the newspapers were talking about yesterday about Israel stopping bombing Gaza is exactly what happened just before President Obama took office. They all made the same promise. He took office, then immediately they began bombing Gaza again. So I'm not optimistic that the bombing is going to stop. I think that the Israeli parties are already have said that they're not supporting Netanyahu if he does live up to the agreement with the United States and does not kill it does not kill all the Palestinians. That's the mentality we're dealing with, and I don't know how there can be a solution under that kind of a situation.
Well, it would be very dangerous. I mean, I understand everything you're saying, but it would be very dangerous at this point for all of the players, including Mr. Trump, if nothing happens. It will make him look like what you just said. It will expose him to being a theatrical prop who goes through the same agreement, Camp David, all of that, with no outcome, with purely distractive window dressing to avoid dealing with the problem. And for a new president who wants to establish and whose whole political career is, I am different from the convention, the Bush, the Clinton, the Obama, I'm not them. Look at how I talk. Look at who I gather around me. Look at who I choose to be in my cabinet. I'm not them. I'm the common man. I'm the, this is not new in history, this play acting at a populism. The Republicans present themselves as something fundamentally different from Democrats. They've tried that for years. They're running out of gas with that, as are the Democrats. And so you need a refresher. Mr. Trump is a refresher. He's really different, you see, from the others. He isn't, of course, any more than they were different from one another in being cheerleaders for capitalism, which is what they each compete with the other to be. And he isn't any different from that. However, he understands that their game, I'm different from one another, is the game to play. And for him, therefore, he's different from both of them. He rejects the conventional Republicans. He rejects the Democrats almost with equal fervor, with equal intensity. And he sets himself up as a de facto third party trying to hold on to the same political regime that the two parties always did. Except I'm new and I'm different, which is what each of the presidential candidates tried to say, and most Americans could care less. I would like to pick up on that last point if I could, Nima. I think another part of what's going on, in addition to everything we've said, is the desire of Mr. Trump, understandably, to deal with a problem, which is that he has no mandate. The election was much too close for there to be any serious talk of mandate. He handles that partly by insisting that he has a mandate. That's the way politics works. If you can't get the reality, well, then use the BS and cover it over with endless repetition. I understand that. So he has to talk about the mandate he doesn't have. But he knows he doesn't have it. So he has to do some theatrical things that will give him more of a support than he actually has. And being able to say, I brought peace to the Middle East is a feather in his cap. It's a useful thing for him to be able to do in the days of just before, and I'm sure the days just after the inauguration. And it will allow him to say to large groups of the American people what they already know, which is he accomplished what Biden year after year said he was in favor of, but could never quite get done. Mr. Biden has paved the way for Mr. Trump, who barely even has to say it. I did it. Biden talked about it, but I did it. He can't back away from that very quickly. And it does something to give him a bit more broad support for all the other things, because there's going to be opposition. If he tries the deportation to Mexico, if he tries the tariff regime, he's going to suffer enormous internal opposition, and he needs to look like a global peacemaker. I believe that's behind all the noise about Greenland and Panama and all that other nonsense, because that he can get the unity of the American people. They don't care, what happens to Greenland. one way or another. And it has a certain romantic notion. We're taking over everywhere. That allows you to have the illusion that your empire isn't shrinking. On the contrary, you're building it. These are gestures that come right out of his dilemmas. And I think that's part of what's going on here.
Well, I hope you're right, Richard. You used the word theatrical prop, and I guess you could say that all U.S. diplomacy is a theatrical plot. And what's the plot? It's all about the narrative. And again, without enforcement powers, how are you going to get beyond the theatrical? That's the problem. Not only for President Trump being a peacemaker in the Near East, but also in Ukraine. I think you're right about this bluster about Panama and about Greenland. I think he's trying to show, that's the theatrical part, that he's trying to show Americans, you see, I'm really pro-American, I'm for American power, therefore let me do what I'm doing in Ukraine, which the American firsters, the anti-Russians, are not going to like, and what I may be able to do in Israel, which also the Zionists, meaning the Democratic Party and their donor class, are not going to like. So basically, that's the problem. What are you going to do about the enforcement for all of this? And the enforcement is not only by the United States on Israel. The enforcement is the executive branch, Trump, over what the State Department does, what the military does. What will he do if the military, State Department, and CIA go about their own policy? He's in a way trying to make foreign policy here, I hope in the way that you say, without consolidating his domestic power over the domestic agencies that did everything they could to prevent his election 4 years ago by the Trump derangement syndrome, and the FBI, the whole support of the Democratic Party, the refusal to look at President Biden acting as a paid agent of the Ukrainian government, negotiated by his son and documented on his son's computer, that he got paid to commit America to the war in Ukraine. I think if Trump cannot do what you hope that he can do, at that point you're going to have, I would hope, Trump do everything he could to really clean out what he's promised to do: the CIA, National Security Agency, military, and the FBI. That's going to be, I think, domestically, an even bigger fight than what he's doing in the Near East.
No, I agree. I think that everything I said depends, you're right, on his being able to pursue this kind of policy. My reading, and I could very well be wrong about this, of course, but my reading is that the act around Israel was already the path of least resistance for him to take. Yeah. That he's not going to lose the support of his major donors in any significant way because of what he did. It will make some of his pro-Israeli donors unhappy, and they may become more open now to becoming enemies of his. That's true. But I don't think that's a big enough group. It's not a big enough phenomena to seriously threaten him, and which is why he took it. I think the contrast between that and either a mass deportation to Mexico or a mass tariff imposition on Mexico, I think that will have much more profound opposition and consequences that will turn major parts of the donor capitalist class in the United States against him. And that will provide allies to the bureaucrats who are looking for donors to be allies in a pushback. Because remember, the bureaucrats can look to the donors for allies and vice versa, and they will find each other,
Yeah.
and they will become what makes it impossible for Mr. Trump to do anything, as they have done to Republican and Democratic presidents in the past. This is not new. This is what American real politics is. They will all make the same bloviating statements, Trump a bit more aggressively than the others, because he has that task of being the new and the different and all of that. Whereas the rest of them play game. Watching, for example, as the Democrats explain to us why the choices for cabinet positions are unqualified. That's really funny, given the people that the Democrats have put into those positions with what qualification other than political loyalty, financial support, and so. I mean, this is really a theatric which has run out of gas. But he's doing the same thing. He has no new plan. He is playing basically the same game as they are, but with a kind of a new face and a new facade. And so, it's a little bit like losing Mr. Biden and substituting Kamala Harris. Okay, you lose Harris and the others, and you get Trump. But it's musical chairs among these people, not a serious problem. But the more serious ones, and that's why we haven't heard all that much about it. We have a few scary statements by the so-called deportation czar, but we don't know what's really going to happen there yet. The pushback, I'm sure, is building already. You see it in the statements of the lady who's now the leader in Mexico, Scheinbaum. She's made it quite clear, but she's also scared because she doesn't know, like we don't, how far this is going to go, how much is going to be tried, and at what point will the consequences, which are extremely dangerous, in my view, for Mexico and thereby for the United States. No one quite knows yet how far that's going to go before the pushback becomes strong enough to stop it. Mexico depends on remittances from the United States, the workers here. It depends for its jobs on exports. If you have a massive deportation, you give it to Mexico the following 3-point blows: reduction serious in remittances, reduction seriously in jobs as your exports are constrained, and by deportation, a vast influx of millions of people replacing the money that isn't coming anymore, the remittances. There's no way that the Mexican government can handle loss of remittances, loss of jobs, influx of people who need jobs. I mean, it is a tsunami. And then you have to ask, what rational mentality would put the open-ended risk of such a tsunami with a country that has a 1,000-mile border with you, whose disruptions are going to overlay you? We may see the most ironic switch of all, a level of migration into the United States far larger than we've had in recent years, because literally the alternative for Mexicans is to quietly die in their own country. And we don't want to face any of that. We have no discussion. It is astonishing that I have to make statements, which I do, about the absurdity of a massive deportation, because the Republicans have made this a mass issue, and the Democrats have basically said, me too. And so there is no discussion, let alone debate, about what this entails. You're going to see a popularized issue, if it's actually pursued, have unbelievable consequences that will only make people 2 or 3 years from now wonder how this hysteria was allowed to develop as far as it clearly has.
Well, the reason we haven't found any discussion of this issue, Richard, is precisely because of what you've just said. It's such a huge magnitude that has been so thoroughly ignored by everyone to think about it because it's too big to think about. It's almost impossible to think about the mass economic destruction and demographic upheaval and the problems between the US and Mexico's balance of payments, that it's easier just not to think about it. You've put your finger on the trauma.
Yeah, I think it extends to Europe too. I don't think we're giving anyone. The Europeans are now in what must be for them the realization of a nightmare. The European countries, like Israel, got into bed, hitched their wagon, became dependent on the United States as their military protector, as their economic partner, as their political guarantor. And we now have a leader who has every interest in breaking from all of that. He's going to make a deal with Mr. Putin. They kind of see it coming. And it'll be a deal to end the war in Ukraine, or at least suspend it. And every major leader in Europe has hitched his or her wagon to being supportive in Ukraine. The only exceptions, and they're not much of one, but the only exceptions are, the Hungarians and the Czechs a little bit and so on. But the others are all doing this. And that's why you're seeing, Mr. Macron in France, he's got no approval. He's a political dead weight. He has no future. It's even more pathetic to watch Mr. Starmer in England running around trying to keep going a war in which he was always a junior partner and had no real influence. Mr. Schultz, who's already on his way out because he made that mistake. By the way, I noticed that Mr. Schultz, in order to get any leverage for his election, has to become anti-Trump. I don't know if you caught him. He's so desperate that he's trying to switch in midstream. I don't think it'll fool very many German voters. It might, but I don't think so. Too little, too late. He denounced Mr. Trump for wanting to take over other territory. That's very strange. You're fighting Mr. Putin for taking over territory. So what? Suddenly, your great ally is talking about more territory involving more people than anything going on in Ukraine. It is bizarre what these people and economically, look at them. Europe is sinking between the United States on one hand and China on the other, and it's a process that is becoming obvious. We have our high tech. The Chinese match us. The Europeans, nothing, nowhere. I noticed that my friend Yanis Varoufakis goes around Europe explaining, as a European economist and a European political leader, because he happens to be both, that he refers to Europe, his continent, as stupid. I mean, it's extraordinary. He's a very smart man. I know him pretty well. I read his work. But the only one, just like he was the only one who understood that bailing out Greece wasn't bailing out Greece. It was bailing out the French and British and German banks who were owed a lot of money, which the European government gave to the Greek government on condition they would use it to pay back the banks. It was Europe taking care of Europe at Greece's expense. routing the money through, and he had at least the courage to say so, which is why they had to get rid of him. I mean, you couldn't even allow it to be said. But I think that's a crisis building very quick. I think you're going to see real political turmoil in Europe because the existing, just like here, the existing Democrats and Republicans prepared the way for Mr. Trump's theater. You're seeing that same process in Europe. And whether the new face comes from the left, which is what you have in France, or it comes from the right, which is what you have in Germany, you're going to see the same basic story unfolding. And it's going to be another nail in the coffin of the American empire because its junior partner, Europe, is going to become a tremendous problem and not much of an ally.
I think you're right, Richard, that the focus of what's considered to be the war in Ukraine has been Europe all along. The war in Ukraine has not weakened Russia. If anything, as we've discussed, it strengthened it. But what it has done is amazingly weakened Europe. Now, I don't think it's possible for any agreement to be made between Trump and Putin to settle the Ukrainian situation because the war is still on. When one side is winning a war, as Russia's finally just cleaning up the Ukrainian army, there cannot be any such thing as a ceasefire or any plan for a post-war settlement because the settlement has to be made on the battlefield, not diplomatically. So all that Trump can do is say, we're not going to spend any more American money on Ukraine. That will be what he's doing. And what he said is more. You've had his one of his cabinet ministers saying that if Europe really feels what the NATO leader has said, if America loses the war against Russia in Ukraine, that Putin will march right through to the Atlantic Ocean and destroy Europe. And so a loss, settling the fighting in Ukraine in anything less than a total NATO victory is a total European loss. So the Trump cabinet has said, well, if that's the case, if you want money and you want American support, you've got to buy enormous amounts of treasury bills. And in fact, you've got to pay the war in Ukraine. What Trump says is, this is not our war against Russia. We want peace. This is Europe's war against Russia. Europe and NATO countries in Europe should pay for the war, not us. And of course, how do you pay for war? Well, you need arms. And Europe's arms industry has been destroyed by the United States sanctions against Russia. And so this means, as we've discussed before here, I think in the 2 weeks while you were gone, an enormous payment to the United States by Europe, a reduction in the euro's exchange rate and a rise in the dollar's value against Europe. You're having that especially now that the Federal Reserve here has been raising its interest rates to 4.8% for 10-year treasuries. There's an enormous inflow into the dollar and a rising dollar. Trump, I want to talk a bit about this balance of payments dimension of the war, because this is going to be where a lot of the squeeze on the Trump administration foreign policy is going to come. Trump has said, I think incorrectly, that he wants a low dollar value so that will make American exports less expensive. He's living in the past. That was the case when American industry was competing with European and Asian and other industry That's not the case anymore. We're deindustrialized. The rest of the world is dependent on U.S. oil and U.S. farm products. And it doesn't matter what the exchange rate is. They have to pay whatever the price is. The actual effect of Trump's policies is going to say America has to be the financial winner. Imagine if America puts the tariffs that Trump has promised on against Europe, not to mention Canada and Mexico. That's going to reduce America's imports and increase the balance of trade to further strengthen the dollar. Everything that Trump is trying to do to help, what he says, help the American economy, is going to raise the price of the dollar against foreign currencies so much that this is going to destabilize the entire international financial system. For instance, if the dollar goes up against the global South countries, their debts are in dollars, but their ability to pay the debts is in their own currency. They will have to spend much more of their domestic budget to pay the dollar debts that they have, or they'll have to default. Same problem is going to happen in Europe. If Europe pays what President Trump is insisting that they pay for NATO, for U.S. arms, for tariffs that are imposed on them, then they're going to have to drastically cut back spending. Well, a few days ago, the military, one of the military advisors of, I think, the German government said, we need, instead of a bank for social spending, given the fact that the German constitution says you can't run a budget deficit beyond a marginal amount, we have to have a NATO war bank. They've actually suggested that Europe set up a special NATO war bank to attract savings, paying high interest rates in order to afford to spend the money on NATO, the 5% of GDP. This is paying 5% of the GDP for war against Russia and Ukraine is the equivalent of a 4 percentage point decline in GDP. This means that Europe will impose upon itself, or will be imposed by Trump, the equivalent of the 1929 crash in the United States. Europe will be broke. Well, I can imagine many of Trump's supporters saying, this is great. We're billionaires. We can come in and buy Europe industry cheap. We can buy European companies cheap. It's as if from Europe's perspective and the perspective of many American investors, the Ukraine war is all about checkmating Europe and permitting a huge takeover, given the illusion in Europe that Russia is going to invade and is somehow threatening Europe by exporting gas and oil and making it more dependent. This crazy narrative that is official policy that obviously is pushed by the American politicians over there is going to make Europe the most unstable of all of the areas that we've talked about, even Mexico and the Near East. Although I guess you could say there's going to be chaos everywhere in the next 6 months.
Well, the issue of Europe, let me expand a little bit to make sure that people understand what Michael just said. The exchange rate between the dollar and the euro was about $1.02 for a euro the last 2 or 3 days. It may be $1.03 now. That is already extremely low. It means that all a European gets when a European wants to exchange euros for dollars is $1.02 for each euro. Well, that's a lot less than you could get for a euro over most of the last 20 years. This is a very big deal, especially if it drops, which it has very rarely done and not for long, below parity. But that's where it seems to be headed. And that means, relative to the history, Europe is in terrible trouble because it does, particularly Germany, it depends on it on exports. And it's not attractive because of what the euro isn't worth. This is a serious problem for them, with or without having to pay for the Ukraine war if it continues. But let's assume that Michael is right, and I think it points that way, that we're not going to get a quick end to the Ukraine war, although Mr. Trump will try for it, but we won't get it. The Europeans have boxed themselves in. They're committed to this. Their political careers depend on it, but they are destroying their own economic viability. If the United States acts, as Trump has said, to spend much less money on the war in Ukraine, which has already happened in the last year of Mr. Biden because of Republican opposition in the Congress, then the Europeans are going to be in an incredible place. They either have to go along with a deal in Ukraine that makes all of their pronouncements about the life and death look like the theater it always was. That's a death knell for their own political survival. If, on the other hand, they have to pay much more for the war, they will not be able to do that and afford their social welfare system. And if they cut that, which they've been doing, they're going to provoke the extreme left and the extreme right, which has already happened. The extreme left in France, the extreme right in Germany. And that's going to undo them politically, which means we have an either or whose net result is the same either way. They cannot survive. They cannot go to their people who are already unhappy with the Ukraine war, barely supporting them, and say it's now going to cost you your pension. That would be Mr. Macron. Or a whole host of social services. That was Schultz. They can't do that. It's not a viable arrangement. And there's no golden miracle that's going to come down the road and save them, because the whole world is industrializing in place of Europe. This is a very weird situation. And notice that the emerging bloc in the world economy, BRICS, is noteworthy because it's not about Europe. Europe is outside the story. The BRICS is the global south. There was a rumor, I believe it's true, that a year or two ago, Mr. Macron actually inquired whether France could join the BRICS. And he was told, no, thank you. Meanwhile, last week, Indonesia, one of the largest countries in the world, population 280 million people. That's not much smaller than the United States. Joined the BRICS. I mean, the writing is on the wall. You have to be blind not to see. This is not good for Europe, and Europe remains the chief ally of the United States. It is destroying its own allies, and it can't figure out a way not to do it. and it is irritated with obstacles to doing that. And I think you're going to see growing anxiety in Europe if Mr. Trump is able to achieve even a small part of the only way forward he sees. This is an accumulation. I know this is beating the dead horse, but we have to. This is an accumulation of problems that haven't been solved. The problem of the dollar, the problem of balance of payments, the problem of internal productivity, the problem of changing global trade patterns, and above all, the emergence of China and its allies with their own agenda, who are not held back by the kinds of problems that are affecting the West. And that's the story of the decline of one global regime and the emergence of another. We are living through that. But we shouldn't be so focused on each of the little steps at risk of losing the larger picture.
Well, since you pointed out all these complications, I might as well add another one. There's one country that's just off the coast of Maine politically, and that's Great Britain. And in the last few days, you've had the British Prime Minister Sturmer go to I'm blocking out, to try to start a war with Russia and Azerbaijan by going to Armenia and trying to sign a contract with Armenia and to essentially open a new military front in Armenia against Azerbaijan and Russia with the intention of stopping the oil pipeline and Belt and Road initiative that Russia and China are trying to extend westward. What will the United States and Trump do about Britain's essentially, Britain is doing what Netanyahu is doing. It is trying to force America into a war with a larger power, just like Netanyahu wants to drag America into war with Iran. England wants to drag the United States into a war with Russia and Azerbaijan, and probably spreading to Turkey as well. I would imagine that if Putin and Trump sit down, one of the first things that Putin is going to say about, well, you know, you're talking about stopping aggression, but right now your English puppet is accelerating its aggression in Armenia. How can you stop that? This is going to be a complicated factor that I think can blow up just as much as Europe. I don't consider England, Britain to be really part of Europe politically. And I think Europe has no desire ever to absorb Britain in, but I just wanted to fill out all of the complicating chaos areas that we've discussed.
Yeah, and I think it just goes to tell you, you know, it underscores that we are living at a time of mounting global, multiple economic problems that are the result of a failure to deal with them for quite a while. And now they are, how shall I put it, reinforcing or feeding one another. So that what you can't do in Central Asia worsens your problem in Europe or vice versa. What you can't do, you know, in Canada or Mexico makes other problems you have that much worse. The grandiose notion of deporting tens of millions of people, it's extraordinary. The very idea of doing that, no matter what happens, shows you these are very extreme problems. If you're thinking in these kinds of extreme terms about how to solve them, even before you get to the feasibility, look at the language, look at the tone of what it is you're going to do. And if his judicial appointments wage a revenge war against Democrats, if that part of the theater is taken seriously, then we're back to the point that Michael made earlier, that the internal struggles in this society add a whole nother uncertainty as to the outcome of all of this. There's no reason to expect that this country will be any further along in solving its problems after 4 more years of Trump than it was after the first 4 years of Trump or the next 4 years of Biden. Nothing is happening here that gives you the reason, a sense, we're going to be dealing with these problems in an effective way. Just
If only things were that solvable, Richard. I don't think these are problems. They're quandaries. A problem has a solution. A quandary doesn't. In a quandary, you're stuck. There's nothing that you can do to solve the problem as it's formulated, as it exists. And the way that we've been formulating the tensions and antagonisms at work, I don't see any reasonable solution. So I don't see any basis for how either I or you or anyone else can really forecast the kind of chaos that we're going to be seeing in the next half year to year.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think I'm responding. If I ask myself why I reason the way I do, I'm responding to the fact that people ask me an awful lot, as I'm sure they do with you too, Michael, and you too, Nima.
Well, we're reasonable.
Asking for solutions. So I feel like I ought to try to provide one. But my own logic takes me to where you are, which is, wow, this is quite a collection of difficulties. And I can see that we're going to have some remarkably weird, ad hoc, knee-jerky kind of responses as the quandary makes itself felt in the minds of people to whom everyone is looking for solutions as well. I don't even know if the Israeli government can survive another week under these conditions. There are threats from at least several of the cabinet members to quit if Netanyahu accepts. He seems to have accepted, so we're wondering, are they going to quit? If they do, his government falls. And then the question is, what comes next? And nobody quite knows what comes next.
If all the actors in Europe and Israel and Mexico and America were as reasonable as you and I are, then the problems could be solved. But or even we would be able to say, here's a reasonable solution with a good chance of our forecast being right. But how do you forecast people who are unreasonable? And I think we're dealing with unreasonable people in Israel, unreasonable people in Ukraine, unreasonable leaders in Europe. This is the problem that makes any kind of rational forecasting impossible.
And
well, maybe I disagree at least a little bit here. I think history blows away the people that you're describing. I agree with you. Those are the people. They are very unreasonable. They've been able to survive. I don't see them being able to survive much longer. Okay. That may be very naive on my part, but I have this sense that in the end, in ways I may be very horrified by, the historical tensions we are now living through are going to blow a lot of these politicians out of the water. The inadequacy of their theater, which defines their whole careers, will make them persona non grata in their own societies, and they will go into physical and emotional decline because they've become totally, irrelevant. I understood Angela Merkel when she explained that the whole point of the deals made with Russia and so on in 2014 around Ukraine were understood to be ploys to give them the time to arm and equip the army there, the Ukraine army. But I thought the admission was interesting that she now felt, having become marginalized by all of what happened, that she could and she should say that. She knew what the consequences would be, and they were what she thought they would be. But she wanted, the way some people, when they get close to dying, feel the need to say things they have kept secret for most of their lives. I think that happens to these politicians too. And that I read it as a kind of admission that what she had been able to focus on and succeed at in Germany after unification was no longer possible, that the conditions in Europe had changed, and that the Germany upward and onward as the powerhouse of the European economy, as the great exporter of the capitalist world, this was done. I mean, between what had happened, what the Chinese did, and the change in the United States, and the declining Western Empire, Germany was caught. And Germany has been caught ever since. The decline of Germany from being the engine of the European economy to now being among the worst performers of the European economies, currently either in recession or very close thereto. I mean, that is an extraordinary come down, and no one sees a reversal of this.
I think what you said a minute ago is quite correct, not naive at all. The current actors in the world political stage will be gone during the year. They cannot survive in the maelstrom that we're going to be seeing. And in fact, they have to be gone in order for any resolution to take place.
Yeah. Which my guess is probably bothers them, if not during their waking hours, then in their nightmares.
Just to wrap up this session, Richard and Michael, how do you see the situation in Germany right now? Elon Musk is trying to support AfD, Alternative for Germany. And he says that what I'm doing in Germany is against what Soros is doing in Europe. He tries to legitimize what he's doing in Germany. And is that of concern? These people are interfering in the internal affairs of a foreign country which doesn't have any sort of connection with them, and they don't care about Germany after all. Why are they doing this?
Well, Mr. Musk is now, if I've understood the numbers correctly, the private owner of something around $400 billion. Okay. If that's invested at 5%, the man earns $20 billion a year on the $400 billion he owns. $20 billion a year is around $400 million, if I have it correctly, a week. Which means what he had to pay to buy the Trump government was 2 days worth of his income. So he can afford to buy any and every government that's for sale in the world without it making a material difference in his total wealth, nor much of a dent on the accumulation of more wealth based on that wealth. So he is doing the logic of capitalism. Capitalism has always been a system that produces and reproduces unequal distributions of wealth, which are used to buy unequal distributions of power, because that's the only way to guarantee the survival of the unequal distribution of wealth. So we know how it works, because it has worked that way, both before and during capitalism. This is just the end result. You have now produced enough so that an individual can buy multiple governments. Mr. Musk has now bought the American government, and he has made major moves to buy the Canadian, the Argentinian, and now the German governments. And those are rich countries. Most other countries are cheaper for him to buy. And he may have bought them. I don't follow him that closely. But he played a major role in Argentina to support Milei, who's going to have a large difficulty surviving, Mr. Trudeau, whom he basically helped knock off, and now Mr. Schultz, whom he's working hard to defeat. And I think, yes, all of those political forces will have big debts to Mr. Musk, which he will collect on. And that will make him more wealthy, and so he can buy more. But that's how this works. And the liberals who moan and groan about all of this are just fakers. They're the ones who can't find the common thread here, because it traces itself back to Karl Marx. Of course, therefore, has to be a taboo. They all know what's going on. Many of them are competing for Mr. Musk's money as they speak. And George Soros, that's childish. That's a convenient whipping boy in half a dozen countries, either because he funded a lot of anti-Russian activity at one point, so he endeared himself to them. Then he funds anti-communist activity that endears him to the right, and he funds anti-leftist stuff that endears him more to the right. This is not serious. He's just looking for the bullshit that covers the money. What he has is money, and that's basically all he has, and that's what he's using. But he has the money in a system which values the money above all else, so puts him in a very powerful position. And there's no opposition that I can see. It's extraordinary. The level of corruption, if by that you mean the dependence of the political system on the richest entities that they supposedly govern, that has been going on for so long that it has become routine and normalized and acceptable. And he gets away with being only the most extreme example, but the idea of it has long been accepted. That's what Michael meant before when he referred to Citizens United or any of the other legislative steps and regulations in one country or another that allow the money to make the difference. I mean, it is really, it makes the commitment of, what is it called now? Value-driven, an international value-driven system, such an absurd joke, such a horrible irony perpetrated on the people. I mean, we don't have a value-driven international system. We have an international system that is totally for sale and is being purchased by the richest among us, which is how a market system works. As people like Michael and me, when we teach, we explain to an audience what is so elemental that the only really interesting question is, why do you have to explain this to people? It's like explaining in the morning the sun comes up. Well, it shouldn't come as much of a surprise. A market is a system that, when there's a scarcity of goods, allocates the scarcity to those who have the most money. Because a scarcity, a demand greater than supply, which is all that scarcity ever meant, when there's a demand greater than supply, you don't distribute the supply according to people's needs, according to people's work, according to people's contribution. You distribute it by having the price be bid up, so only the richest can afford it. And there is no ethical or moral system that I know of that justifies doing that. The rich person gets the scarce milk to feed their cat, while the poor person goes without the milk needed to feed their children. That's the way the market works.
Well, that chaos is probably a good point to end the whole discussion.
Thank you so much for being with us today, Richard and
All right.
Michael. Great pleasure as always.
Glad to be back and enjoy these very much.
Yeah. See you. Bye bye.